Well, I think it's clear his health is not good. I mean, you can just see the difference in his face. I mean, he's suddenly become rather puffy. He looks much more the 70 years that he is. He's not been seen in public for a very long time, certainly until the outbreak of until the invasion. And the rumours are that he's suffering from some form of cancer and possibly is on steroids.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're joined by Michael Binyon, who has been a leader writer, columnist, and foreign correspondent for The Times for 50 years. In his 15 years based overseas, he's reported from Moscow, Washington, Bonn, and Brussels before becoming diplomatic editor and chief foreign leader writer. He's an award-winning journalist and author of Life in Russia. Michael, great to have you on Frontline. Thank you so much for your time. I'm just wondering what thoughts went through your mind in the last week with this extraordinary events surrounding the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Does anything surprise you anymore?
No, it doesn't surprise me. What's still unclear is who's benefiting and who's got the advantage. One would immediately think, well, of course, Putin did it and he will benefit, and it's a way of eliminating his enemies, which is the automatic reaction, and it suggests Russia is simply a mafia state. And I think that's probably a perfectly reasonable assumption. But it's not absolutely clear that Putin has benefited from this. I mean, even if he ordered it or his cronies ordered it, does it strengthen him or weaken him? Does it actually increase tensions within Russia? Does it make it easier to win the Ukraine war or more difficult? So all of this, I mean, the outcome is still pretty uncertain.
So questions yet to be answered, you'd say?
I would think so, certainly. And of course, Russia being such a secretive place, we probably never will know the exact outcome. And we don't really quite know what the plotting and the machinations going on in the Kremlin are at the moment.
Obviously, he's now dead and buried. No state funeral for Prigozhin, in spite of the fact he'd been awarded a Hero of Russia order. How do you interpret the way, though, that President Putin has reacted publicly to his death?
Well, it's the typical mafia reaction. You know, you rub somebody out and then bring flowers to the funeral. And, that's how it always was, certainly in classic mafia tradition. It's the idea that the state was not responsible. He was not responsible. Therefore, he is expressing condolences. He's making it quite clear, of course, Prigozhin had faults, as he said, committed mistakes. Well, he could hardly not say that, having denounced him vigorously the day after, or the day that the mutiny happened 2 months ago. So it's obvious to everybody that they were not friends as they used to be. But I think paying tribute to him is a way of sort of saying, yes, it's all being handled normally. It's an accident. We're looking into it. We are, a normal state.
Not friends as they used to be. At one point, Putin seemed to pardon Prigozhin after that failed mutiny. He invited him for tea at the Kremlin with his cronies, and he allowed him sanctuary in Belarus. It looked like he was going to carry on Wagner's activities in Africa. What changed?
Well, I think the realization that Wagner was actually pretty popular and that his revolt, although brief and only lasting a day or so, was applauded by quite a lot of people, including several in the military. And those military generals who were suspected of having supported him have themselves now disappeared, General Surovikin for one. And I think that worried Putin, the idea that the popular acclaim for Wagner was in some way directed against the Kremlin and against the army leadership. Must have been extremely worrying. I think the pardon was tactical. I mean, it was something that he felt he had to sort of stop the revolt. He did a deal, but I think he never intended really to keep it. And the whole Belarus thing was a bit of a kind of sideshow. I mean, nobody quite knows what that was all about and whether Belarus really had any input into this deal or not.
And what about the public? Is it possible to know what they make all of this, the public in Russia? A Sunday Times poll of Russian people found that 8% thought Vladimir Putin was responsible for Prigozhin's death, but the majority thought his death was staged. Do you think we can really know what the Russian people think?
Well, it depends who asks the question, and I think Russians are very wary of voicing opinions at the moment that would appear to be hostile to the government, or particularly to Putin. So the fact that only 8% thought that Putin was responsible, it doesn't surprise me at all, even if 88% actually thought that but didn't want to say so. These opinion polls, I mean, they get some kind of snapshot. If it's on something less political, you might get a slightly more reliable answer. But it's clear that if at least 45% or however many thought that it was a staged the death was somehow not a natural death, or it wasn't a real accident, well, that also doesn't surprise me, because how could you think otherwise?
I mean, you reopened at the Times Moscow office during what you described as the dozy days of Brezhnev, proper communism, you put it. At the time, did you think it would last?
Well, it did seem to be running into a buffer. Economically, it was really getting worse and worse for the Russians. They just weren't keeping up. They weren't keeping pace. They were trying to keep up with America militarily. It was clear that it was far beyond their resources and that they just didn't have the heart for it. And also, the ideology had become so stale that nobody really believed it. It was just sort of going through the motions. I didn't really see how it would end. I thought it would just sort of fade somehow, or that they would be some reforms in the system. I didn't see that the whole thing would collapse, and with it, the whole country.
Of course, Mikhail Gorbachev was the eighth and final Soviet leader of the Soviet Union. You spent his 80th birthday with him in London. Now, just over a year since his passing, do you think he was the last pro-Western Russian leader?
He was the last realistic Russian leader. He was the last one to see that the communist system simply didn't work. I mean, I wouldn't call him entirely pro-West. What he was anti-confrontation. He wanted peaceful coexistence, real peaceful coexistence with the West. And that meant making some concessions abroad, for example, withdrawing from Eastern Europe. But he was also, to some extent, a realist. He realized that Russia had neither the money nor the will nor the capability of keeping hold of its Eastern European empire, and that if Russia wanted to advance materially and economically, they had to start thinking about a new way of doing things.
When communism fell, there was hope that Russia would come into the world community. What happened?
I think the West handled it fairly badly. I mean, the West sort of just took it for granted and said, "Oh, well, Russia doesn't matter anymore," and that, they may be a country with missiles, but frankly, we don't have to pay much attention to them. And I think Russia's interests were deeply hurt, and particularly they lost face. They felt humiliated. They were humiliated by their own kind of collapse and their own economic chaos, which followed the end of communism. And the West could have been more supportive. The West, I think, stirred up a sort of feeling of resentment, and that wasn't really a good thing. And then nationalists in Russia, and there were plenty of those, took advantage of that, and they reasserted, that Russia is a great power and needs to be treated as such.
You could argue, obviously, that the West, that history is repeating itself, that the West has misunderstood Russia yet again with the current situation in Ukraine. Why does there seem to be this, speaking from your own experience, why does there seem to be this apparent misunderstanding of Russia?
Well, the Russians, to some extent, are their own worst enemies. I mean, they're either cowed or they're bullies. They either bully their neighbors around them to make sure that they're the big power and that they dominate, or they're intimidated by what they see as, the West ganging up on them, being surrounded by hostile states or things of that kind. So they strike out, and they strike out in a fairly aggressive way. And it's quite easy for Russians to look back in history and say, well, the threat has always come from the West. They look at Napoleon, they look at Hitler, they look at, the many times they were invaded from Poland, and those sort of deep suspicions don't go away very easily. And now we're back into that same thing where they feel that the entire West, if not the world, well, certainly the West, is up against them, and that NATO is determined to humiliate them.
Is that a genuine paranoia, or is that one that's actually convenient for Putin's strategy?
It's extremely convenient for his strategy, but it builds on a genuine feeling. Nationalism is there. Nationalism has always been, to some extent, the sense of, Mother Russia and Mother Russia's sort of fate. And I have to say, it's very bound up with the church as well, which at the moment is absolutely hand in glove with Putin. There is a sort of deep-seated resentment of others. There's certainly also some jealousy that the rest of the world seems to be doing better. But the key thing that the Russians seem unable to grasp is that if you have a system based on strong men dictating without any opposition, you will never get the kind of democracy that's going to encourage innovation and the kind of economic progress that they want.
So how would you assess how President Putin has changed Russia? Where do you see his and the country's future?
Well, he goes in two parts. The first few years, the first, say, 6 or 7 years, were pretty good, and Putin did a pretty good job. He brought stability after the chaos of the Yeltsin years. He ended the sort of free-for-all, crime on the street and that kind of thing. He brought the oligarchs under control, which certainly was necessary because they were basically just robbing the country blind. And he insisted that the government was there to be obeyed and to be followed. The problem is that he began to lose touch. He had been very close to ordinary people. Being ex-KGB, he kept his ear to the ground, but he began to lose touch. And then he also began to just hear what those who were around him wanted to tell him. And he was young people began to get bored of him. So he started foreign adventures to try to, cement support all around him. And these didn't go terribly well. And then, Syria, very costly. The first invasion of Ukraine, well, it seemed to work, but again, it stirred up greater trouble and things started to go wrong. And I think the fact that there's still plenty of corruption angers a lot of young people. And I think this will, in the end, be his downfall.
Why do you think he started to lose touch?
It happens to almost everybody who's been in power for too long, and particularly if there's no sort of legal form of opposition. I mean, there was a certain amount of freedom of the press, certainly to start with, and there were several papers that were more or less opposition papers. But when they began to start questioning his policy, say, in Chechnya, he didn't like it, and he clamped down on them, and one by one, independent voices have been crushed. And I'm afraid Russia reverts all too quickly to the old model that they've known quite a long time. I mean, the old Stalinist model of absolute control from the top.
To what extent, then, do you think that there is now a generational gap inside Russia, those that remember the Soviet era and those that have been born since, and that the young generation, as you say, are going to be the ones that are going to determine the future and the end of Putin?
Well, I think there's a huge gap. You've put your finger on it. That's exactly the thing. The older ones, they feel it's going right back to how it used to be. Now, they don't necessarily welcome that at all, but they know instinctively what's expected. They know that they don't raise their heads above the parapet. The younger people are sort of bewildered because they've known 30 years or so of relative freedom. I mean, they were free to travel. They could go on holiday to France or wherever, Italy, Europe, anywhere. They were able to import Western goods, enjoy Western lifestyle, which, of course, now is becoming very difficult. And now they can't travel, hardly anywhere. And that is deeply concerning to them. And they're sort of really upset that, that they seem to be controlled, and particularly upset that they're being drafted into the army to fight for a cause which they still don't really know what's it for.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. How does that translate to the views and the attitudes towards the war in Ukraine?
Well, you see it in the huge exodus of young men the moment they extended the draft. I mean, thousands fled to neighboring countries, to Turkey, to Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan. Some were able to continue working remotely, but many just got out as fast as they could. And it's particularly the better educated, those who know what's going on, those who are a bit more mobile than, people from Siberia, say. They're the ones who are getting out, and they're the ones that Russia desperately needs for its future.
We know that Russia is astute in controlling the narrative inside its borders. Opposition is crushed, with politicians like Alexei Navalny given lengthy prison sentences. It's adept at spreading disinformation and misinformation. Okay, you've talked about the people who've left Russia. What about the ones still there? Do they believe the narrative they're fed?
Well, up to a point. I mean, I think the West has miscalculated, thinking that by depriving Russia of sort of Western goods and stopping them traveling abroad, they'll push the middle classes into opposing Putin, and that will force him a change of policy. Well, that's a completely misguided idea. Putin doesn't care at all about the middle classes. He cares about the security services and the army. That's what matters. That's where his power rests. And if the middle classes are discontented, well, bad luck. And of course, he can also then use this situation, turning it around to say, you see, the West hates you. You see how they're trying to target you. You see how ordinary people are being stopped from going. And many people believe that.
And what about the sustained drone attacks that are now being carried out in Russia itself?
Well, they're frightening to some people. I mean, we haven't had mass casualties. I don't think anyone, there have been very few casualties from these. They've caused some destruction. What they've done most of all is hurt the narrative. They've shown that Russia itself is vulnerable, and that this war isn't just a faraway thing, or this special military operation, of course, as they're told to call it, isn't just far away on the Ukrainian border. It could be coming a bit closer, and I think that is frightening a lot of people. I don't think it's a serious military threat to Russia, though.
Can we just talk now a bit about the Pope? He's just caused a lot of controversy over this video speech that he made to the Catholic youth in St. Petersburg. He's been accused of glorifying Russian imperialism, telling them that they are the heirs of the great Russia, allusions to Catherine the Great, Peter the Great. Why would he do this?
I think he's trying to get them on side to show that the West does, to some extent, understand Russian history. I mean, he knows that for the Russians, these things are glorious things. He doesn't want them to feel ashamed of their country. Otherwise, they will simply see the West as permanently hostile, and therefore there won't be any chance of any kind of reconciliation or any way of breaking through to some kind of peace talks, which is obviously what the Pope would like to see and what he would be pushing for. Is hoping still that he can get the church to cooperate in trying to put pressure on the government to maybe open peace talks. I'm not sure that that's going to work, but I think he's not glorifying Russian imperialism so much as paying respect to what is a fact of Russian history.
Was that a miscalculation, though?
I don't think so. I mean, he may have raised eyebrows in the West, but then the Pope is not. He's not a political figure. He's an independent figure. He sees himself as a spiritual rather than a political authority.
When do you think it all started to unravel for President Putin?
Probably in about 2012. That's when he was re-elected, when he came back to power after having switched with Medvedev and become the prime minister. In fact, he controlled the thing all along, even though Medvedev was technically the president. But that election was seen by very many people as a sham. They were disillusioned. They thought that Putin was following the constitution. He was done his 2 terms. He then withdrew, became prime minister. And then all of a sudden, he more or less said, well, it was always agreed that I'd come back again as president. And there was big demonstrations on the street. I mean, a lot of people went out, spoke out. There were comments on television. And he thought, right, I'm not having that, and began to crack down. And I think that's, from then on, he had sort of lost the popular appeal.
Michael, there's long been speculation about President Putin's health, and maybe that might be an explanation for sometimes what's perceived as his erratic behaviour. What's your assessment?
Well, I think it's clear his health is not good. I mean, you can just see the difference in his face. I mean, he's suddenly become rather puffy. He looks much more the 70 years that he is. He's not been seen in public for a very long time, certainly until the outbreak of until the invasion. And the rumours are that he's suffering from some form of cancer and possibly is on steroids. That would explain sudden changes of mood, his sort of erratic behaviour, and also his what appeared to be extreme caution during the COVID pandemic, where he wouldn't let anybody near him. He had this great long table and sat at different ends, because if you're on steroids and COVID is there, then you're really vulnerable. But all this would suggest that it might be a plausible reason for him to move out of the seat of power. He could be promoted, and he could give the plausible reason that his health isn't as good as it was. And I think, of course, at the moment, nobody will announce it, but various people have been logging those going in and out of the Kremlin and have noted that a cancer specialist has been in there something like 35 times in 1 year. I mean, that does suggest something rather unusual. So it's all speculation at the moment, but I think there could be an element of something there.
What do you think he actually wants now with the war in Ukraine?
He wants Ukraine to give up. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, what he wants is for Russia now to be in a position of being able to intimidate Ukraine, even if they don't control the whole of the country, which they obviously clearly are never going to do. He wants them, I suppose, at the very least, to keep all the territory they've got, especially Crimea, because that is key to Russian naval power in the Black Sea, and to get the West to basically back off. Well, it's a difficult hope. I mean, he would like Russia to win, but I'm not sure how he's going to plan to do that.
Many wars started by Russia end up frozen in time, and some have claimed that this war won't end until Vladimir Putin is out. What do you think?
I'm not sure that any successor would make it much easier. I mean, if Putin was overthrown, and I don't quite see that happening, I mean, if he was sort of kicked upstairs, which I think is more likely, in other words, a group of people were saying, look, let's change this around. You can be president of the Security Council, say, the Russian Security Council, so you can claim that you have control of general policy, but another person will take over as president. And we can say quite plausibly that you're suffering from some health problems and you've done 23 years or whatever, and you're now moving up to another post. And then someone else would take over. But whoever took over certainly wouldn't be a cozy, friendly liberal. It would be somebody just as hardline and probably just as determined for a military victory.
Well, what do you think? Presumably, the way this war ends is going to be absolutely pivotal in future relations with Russia and Russia's position in the world. How do you think the West should be preparing for that moment?
I think it will end in stalemate. It will end in a sort of frozen situation, and it will end because of China. They're the only ones who can push Russia into an end to the actual fighting. They can come up with a solution by which Russia declares they have liberated the territories that were being oppressed. They have won a great victory, that there will now be Russian, in the interests of saving Russian lives and consolidating Russian support, there will be a ceasefire. I don't think there are going to be peace talks. Neither side trust each other an inch. Certainly Zelensky is not going to do business with Putin. It may end up like one of those conflicts that end with no more fighting, say like North and South Korea, but never a peace treaty. Or, for example, the Kashmir War way back in 48, which ended with just a sort of line of control where the armies stopped, that's where the border is. And that's probably how it might be. Now, this leaves the West in a rather difficult position. Do they acknowledge, do they repair Russian relations with Russia? I think relations with Russia will remain pretty frozen for a long time. I mean, slowly they may do business on things like climate change or, terrorism or big things like that. But there won't be the Western involvement that there was until recently.
And when you sit back, Michael, on your 50-year career, looking at things like this, I mean, what's your overriding view of the current situation?
Well, it's threatening, it's serious, it's certainly one of the most challenging things for Europe since the Second World War. It's the worst war, actual hot war we've had since the Second World War. The only thing is that it does seem that at the moment, some sort of common sense is prevailing because we're not talking about a move to nuclear weapons. I think even the hardliners in the Kremlin know that that would be absolutely catastrophic. And I think China has privately as well as publicly made that absolutely clear that that is completely out of the question. So I think there are limits to this war, but nevertheless, an awful lot of people are getting killed and it's very unpleasant.
Michael Binyon, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer, Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so now, or you can listen to the radio, Times Radio, for the latest news updates and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. From me, Kate Chabot, though, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.